Welcome to Warhammer 40,000 Lore to Sleep To. Today we'll be exploring the origins and other details of Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves Legiones Astartes. So lie back, relax, and let's begin. A child of Fenris. Listen, and hear the tale of the Wolf King as it was told in the longhouses of Fenris, where the fire gutters against the endless dark and the ice groans like a living thing beyond the walls. Before he was a Primarch. Before he was a king. Before he was the chosen son of the All-Father himself. He was simply a child, tumbling from the heavens in a vessel of strange and silent metal, crashing into the frozen wastes of Fenris as though the world itself had reached up and seized him. Fenris is not a world that forgives weakness. It is a world of glacier that move like slow inevitable death. Of seas that freeze and crack and swallow whole villages in a single night. Of creatures that have no name in any civilized tongue, because no civilized man has ever survived the meeting. It is a world that kills, endlessly and without malice, because killing is simply what it does. And yet the child lived. He was found not by men, but by wolves. The great direwolves of Asaheim. Beasts the size of horses, old as the ice and twice as cold. They did not kill him. Perhaps they recognized something in him. Perhaps the wolves of Fenris have always known more than men give them credit for. He ran with them. He learned their ways. He learned the language of wind and blood and track and tooth. And when at last men found him, half wild and burning with a light no Fenrisian winter could extinguish, it was already too late to make him anything other than what he was. The wolf had already been born. Childhood name. The people of Fenris are not gentle in their naming. They do not give their children soft names meant to comfort or to soothe. A name, to a Fenrisian, is a truth. Earned or waiting to be earned, cut from the same hard stone as the land itself. When King Thengir's people first looked upon the feral child dragged in from the glacier, half-clothed in wolf fur and smelling of the wild, they saw immediately that he was not as other children. He was too large, too fierce, too quiet in the way that predators are quiet. Not from timidity, but from patience. He watched everything. He missed nothing. It did not take long for the name to come. Leman. In the old tongue of Asaheim, spoken around fires that have burned since before the tribes kept records, it means simply this. He who is the greatest warrior. Not a prophecy. Not an aspiration. A statement of observed fact, offered by men who were themselves warriors of terrible repute, men who did not hand out praise as lesser peoples hand out pleasantries. They called him Leman because they looked at a half-wild child, barely grown to boyhood, and could not in good conscience call him anything else. There is something worth sitting within that. He had not yet slain a great beast. He had not yet led men into battle. He had not yet done any of the things that would make his name echo across 10,000 years of history. And still they knew. Fenris has always recognized its own. Loyal wolf companions. A king without companions is merely a man with a title. This the Fenrisians understood in their bones, as they understood the cold, and the dark, and the long silence of the tundra in deepest winter. And so it was that Leman did not walk his early years alone. Their names were Freki and Jerry. Two wolves, raised alongside the boy from cubhood, growing as he grew, learning as he learned. Though what they learned and what he learned were not always the same thing, and it would be a mistake to think the teaching ran only in one direction. Wolves are ancient creatures in the reckoning of Fenris. They remember things men have forgotten. Freki was called the Swift. She moved like thought. Like the shadow of a thing before the thing itself arrives, all lean muscle and impossible acceleration across the frozen ground. To see Freki run was to understand why the prey animals of Asaheim had learned over long generations to simply accept their fate. There was no outrunning her. Jerry was called the Cunning. Where Freki overwhelmed, Jerry understood. He would watch and wait, and when he moved it was because he had already seen the end of the matter and was simply closing the distance between the present and the inevitable. Together, the three of them, boy and wolves, became something the stories struggle to name. A pack, certainly. A fellowship. A small and ferocious family forged not from blood but from cold and hunger and the particular trust that only wilderness can build. They would be with him for a very long time. The Kraken Slayer Axe. Every warrior, in every age, has their first true weapon. Not the stick seized in a childhood quarrel, not the borrowed knife of a father or a brother, but the first weapon that is theirs. Shaped to their hand, answering to their will. That looks back at them from the forged light and says, yes, I was made for you. For Leman of Fenris, that weapon was an axe. The Krakens of the Fenrisian seas are creatures of legend even amongst a people for whom legend is simply another word for history. They rise from depths that have no name, from waters so cold and dark that light itself seems reluctant to travel there. They are vast and ancient, and when they come, whole fishing fleets disappear as though they never existed. One such creature came, in the early years of Leman's youth, to waters it should not have entered. It did not leave them. The details of the slaying vary with the telling. This is the nature of Fenrisian saga, where truth and glory have always enjoyed a comfortable proximity. But the bones of the story do not change. The boy went into the water, or met the beast at the ice's edge, or lured it onto the shallows where its size became a disadvantage. And when it was done, he had a kraken. From its spine, that vast, pale ridge of cartilage, harder than iron when cured properly, harder than pride, a weapon was made. A great axe, heavy enough that most men could not lift it without assistance, perfectly balanced in the hands of one man. In those hands it was never still for long. The Wolf of the Plains. They called the thunderwolves by many names on Fenris. The moving mountains. The glacier with teeth. The reason you did not go out onto the plains alone after midwinter. The thunderwolves of Asaheim were not the great direwolves that had raised Leman in his earliest years. Those were ancient and knowing creatures. Predators of a high and particular order. Thunderwolves were something else entirely. Enormous beyond the telling of it, scaled to the proportions of a world that had been building larger and larger things since before men arrived. They moved in packs, and when a pack of thunderwolves ran, the ground itself gave notice of their coming. Fang was the greatest of them. He had been ranging the plains of Asaheim for years beyond counting by the time Leman came to the plains as a youth, still growing into the impossible proportions he would one day reach. Fang's pack had broken chieftains and scattered armies and brought low more than one hero who had made the mistake of believing that size alone was sufficient preparation for the encounter. Leman went out onto the plains. He went, as far as the stories agree, largely alone, accompanied only by Freki and Jerry, who were already formidable in their own right but who were as cubs beside Fang's bulk. He went without ceremony, without declaration, without the elaborate ritual that such hunts usually demanded. He came back with Fang's pelt across his shoulders and the rest of the pack following behind him. Subdued, adopted, folded into his growing household of unlikely companions. Fenris had taught him to run with wolves. He had simply been paying attention. The Saga of the Beast Slayer. A warrior who does not remember his deeds is a warrior who cannot learn from them. And a warrior who cannot learn is simply a danger waiting to happen to himself. This, perhaps, is why Leman composed his sagas. The Fenrisians have always been a people of oral tradition. Words carried in the memory and passed through the breath, from elder to child, from school to listener, across the long winter nights when there is nothing to do but feed the fire and keep the dark at bay with stories. Writing is a thing for southerners, for soft peoples who do not trust their minds to hold what matters. But Leman's sagas were something more than the usual boast and battle. He composed them with care, with attention to the specific and the particular. The terrain of a hunt, the behavior of a creature under duress, the way a beast moved when it was afraid versus when it was merely dangerous. They were, underneath the poetry and the glory, instruction manuals. He called them the sagas of the beast's lair, though the title, like most things on Fenris, came from others who observed and named what they saw, rather than from the man himself. Hunters who followed in his territories, and many came. Drawn by the fame of the hunting grounds he had purged and claimed, found his sagas invaluable. More than a few survived encounters they should not have survived because they had listened carefully to a particular verse about how to approach a blind side, or where the soft tissue of a given creature's armor could be found. The Wolf King taught in metaphors. Fenris taught in scars. Both methods worked. The Uviacane Challenge. Fenris has always been a world of many peoples and very few alliances. The ice keeps tribes apart. The darkness keeps villages turned inward. The simple and relentless work of survival leaves very little room for the larger political imaginings that might, in a gentler land, produce unions and confederacies and shared governance. Leman changed this. Not through diplomacy. Diplomacy was not, and would never be, among his primary instruments. He changed it through the Uviacane, the ancient custom of challenge and proof that the Fenrisians had used for centuries to settle disputes of dominance between chieftains. The Uviacane was ritual. It was structured. It was, in its way, civilized. Which is perhaps why Leman chose it rather than simple conquest. A man who simply kills his rivals and takes their holdings creates enemies. A man who defeats those rivals at their own sacred customs, according to their own rules, in front of their own people, creates vassals. The difference matters enormously. He moved from territory to territory, from longhouse to longhouse, accepting the challenges that came. Ritual hunts of great beasts, contests of strength and endurance in conditions that would have killed ordinary men within hours, single combats of a particular and honorable kind. He did not lose. This is the simple and unadorned truth of it. Across territories that had been separated by generations of hostility, across old vendettas and older borders, he moved, and he challenged, and he won. And the men he had bested. Proud men. Hard men. Men who had never bowed to anything. Found themselves, somehow, bowing. Some gifts cannot be refused when they are offered correctly. The Trial of Morkai. Not all battles are fought with axe and blood and the clean honest violence of bodies in contest. Some battles are fought inside the self, in territories that have no map and no landmarks and no guarantee of return. The Trial of Morkai was one such battle. It was a shamanic rite, ancient even in Leman's time, practiced by the rune priests of Fenris, those strange and storm-eyed men who stood at the boundary between the mundane world and whatever lay beyond it, and who were not always entirely comfortable on either side. The trial was not undertaken lightly. It was not offered to every warrior who fancied a vision. It was reserved for those whom the priests looked at and judged ready. Or, more precisely, those whom the priests looked at and judged necessary. What the trial demanded was endurance of a particular and interior kind. The initiate was brought to a place of power, deep in Asaheim's wildest territories, far from the warmth of fire and the comfort of companionship, and there they were left with the cold and the dark and whatever came to meet them in the space between sleeping and waking. What came to meet Leman, the sagas are careful not to fully describe. This is intentional. Some things are diminished by the telling. What they record is the outcome. That he emerged from the trial changed in a way that even Fenrisians, not generally a people given to noticing subtle shifts of character, could see plainly. He spoke, afterward, with a cadence that suggested he was occasionally hearing two conversations at once. The wise learn to listen to more than one world at a time. The Morkai Pact. There are agreements that are not written down. Not because the parties distrust one another, but because to write them down would be to diminish them, to reduce something vast and living, to the small currency of ink and page. The pact between Leman and Morkai was such an agreement. Morkai is the wolf god of Fenrisian belief, the guardian of the threshold between life and whatever lies beyond it. Neither wholly malevolent nor wholly benign, as gods of that station rarely are. He is the two-headed wolf. One face turned toward the living world, one face turned toward the dark. He judges. He permits passage or denies it. He is not worshipped so much as acknowledged, the way one acknowledges the existence of deep water or high falls. The legends say that in the deep of the trial, or perhaps at some separate moment the stories have conflated with it, Leman and Morkai came to an understanding. The specifics are not recorded. This too is intentional. What the sagas preserve is the symbolic shape of it. That Leman did not conquer or defeat the wolf god, nor did he supplicate himself before it. He negotiated, as one apex predator negotiates with another when their territories must, of necessity, overlap. There was something exchanged. Something given and something received, on both sides, in the currency that gods and near-gods traffic in. What Morkai received, the stories do not say. What Leman received, some believe, was the capacity to stand at the edge of the deepest dark and not be taken by it. This, in the long years to come, would prove to have been a wise investment. The coronation of the King of Fenris. There is a moment in the life of certain men, rare men shaped by forces larger than ordinary circumstance, when the long work of becoming is finally complete, and what they have been moving toward all along arrives, not as surprise, but as recognition. For Leman, that moment was the coronation. The tribes of Fenris did not crown their kings in any manner that softer worlds would recognize as ceremony. There were no silken robes, no jeweled circlets lowered by trembling priests, no long recitations of lineage designed to establish legitimacy through the weight of ancestry. Fenris had no patience for such theater. What there was, instead, was this. The chieftains came. The men he had bested in the Uvicane, the leaders of tribes that had never before bent the knee to anything that did not have its teeth at their throats. They came, one by one and then in gathering numbers, to the place appointed, in the heart of Asaheim where the mountains are highest and the sky is darkest. They brought their weapons, as Fenrisian custom demanded. And they laid them down. Not in surrender. Not in defeat. In acknowledgement. A crucially different thing on a world where the distinction between the two is taken very seriously indeed. Leman stood before them, still smelling faintly of the wild, still carrying in his bearing the memory of the years he had spent running with wolves before men found him. He accepted what was offered. He did not make a speech. He did not need to. The Wolf King had simply been recognized at last. Ice Troll Slaying. A king's first duty, in the reckoning of Fenris, is not to legislate, nor to adjudicate, nor to manage the complex administrative concerns that governance, in more settled lands, inevitably produces. A king's first duty is to make the land safer than it was before he came to it. Leman understood this. He had not been raised in courts. He had been raised in the wild, where the measure of a leader is simple and immediate. Other things that were killing us, still killing us, or have you dealt with them? The ice trolls of Asaheim were things of the warp, creatures that wore the shape of trolls the way a lie wears the shape of truth, close enough to be recognizable, wrong in ways that registered first as unease, and then, if you were still alive long enough, as terror. They had been in the deep places of Asaheim since before the tribes had names for themselves, emerging in the longest winters to take what they wanted from settlements too remote to expect aid. Leman purged them. This is the straightforward account. The longer account, preserved in the saga called The Cleansing of the High Places, describes a campaign that ranged across the full breadth of Asaheim, from the coastal fastnesses to the deep interior glacier, hunting creatures that did not always stay in one form long enough to be satisfactorily cornered. He took no great help. He brought his wolves, his axe, and the particular and terrible patience that the wild had taught him. When it was done, the high places were quiet. They had not been quiet in living memory. The people slept. Their king stood watch. The emperor arrives. He came from the sky, as gods do, and as things that are not gods but are sometimes mistaken for them. The ship that descended upon Fenris was unlike anything the tribes had seen, and the tribes of Fenris were not easily impressed, being a people who had long since made their peace with the fact that the universe was enormous and largely hostile and contained wonders that did not particularly care whether you appreciated them or not. But this was different. This demanded attention in the way that certain things do. Not through spectacle alone, but through the quality of weight that accompanied it. The sense that something of consequence had arrived and that the world, in some way not yet visible, would be different afterward. The man who stepped from it was tall. This meant little on Fenris, where the cold tends to produce large people, but the kind of tall mattered. It was the tallness of something that has never once in its existence doubted its right to occupy space. He came to Leman's hall. He was admitted, because even Leman could see that refusing admission would have been a courtesy the stranger neither needed nor would have accepted. They regarded one another across the fire. The king of a death world and the master of a species, with the careful, unhurried assessment of two creatures meeting for the first time at the top of the same food chain. What was said in those first moments, the sagas do not preserve. Some conversations are too important to survive their own telling. Drinking contest victory. It was Leman who proposed the contest, which tells you something about him. A lesser man, or a shrewder one perhaps, might have looked at the figure across the fire and made certain calculations. Might have considered the wisdom of challenging something so obviously beyond the ordinary to a test of any kind. Might have weighed the diplomatic advantages of simply welcoming the stranger with appropriate honor and letting events proceed at their own pace. Leman was not that man. He proposed a drinking contest, and the mead, the great honeymead of Fenris, brewed in barrels sunk below the permafrost and fermented for years in conditions that gave it a character that could most charitably be described as forceful, was brought out in quantities that caused even some of the hardened men of the king's household to exchange glances. They drank through the night. The sagas linger on this passage with evident and understandable relish. The fires burning lower and being fed. The hall growing quieter as the hours moved, the retainers and warriors who had begun the evening with raucous encouragement settling, one by one, into a watchful and increasingly awed silence. The two figures at the table, neither showing in any visible way the accumulation of what they had consumed, regarding one another with the particular focus of men engaged in something that had long since stopped being about the drink. When dawn came, it was the stranger who finally set his cup aside. Leman won. He acknowledged it without boasting, or with only as much boasting as the situation absolutely required. On Fenris, that is considered remarkable restraint. Core identity. The 6th Legion had existed before Leman came to it. They had been called many things in the years of their existence. Designations, numbers, functional identifiers of the kind that large organizations impose upon their components when there is no better organizing principle available. They had fought. They had been effective. They had been, by the measures that the nascent Imperium applied to such things, adequate. Leman looked at them and saw what they could be. This is the gift of certain kinds of leadership. Not the imposition of a shape, but the recognition of a shape that is already there, latent, waiting for someone to see it clearly enough to call it forth. The warriors of the 6th Legion were already fierce. Already capable of an aggression that other legions managed with more obvious effort. Already possessed of something that the more refined assessments of the Imperium tended to classify, with polite uncertainty, as temperament. He gave that temperament a name. He gave it a home. He gave it Fenris. The recruits came from the death world now. Drawn through the trials that the Legion conducted in his name, tested against the same ice and dark and impossible predation that had shaped him. Those who survived the trials survived changed, in ways that went beyond the ordinary transformations of the Astartes process. Fenris pressed itself into them. It became part of their genome, their culture, their understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. The Space Wolves did not join the Imperium's crusade. they hunted alongside it. Genetic legacy. All the Primarchs left something of themselves in their sons. This was the nature of the gift, and of the burden. That the Legion was not merely an army but an inheritance, carrying within its very blood the particular character of the man from whom it had been made. Leman's inheritance was called the Canis Helix. It was present in every space wolf, worked into the gene seed that transformed aspirants into Astartes, woven so deeply into what they became that it could not be separated from them without ceasing to produce what it was meant to produce. It gave them the senses of the wolves that had raised their Primarch. The sense of smell so acute that a space wolf could track a target across days and weather and distance, the hearing that caught frequencies below and above the range of ordinary men, the sight in darkness that made the deep of Asaheim's eternal winters navigable rather than simply lethal. It made them exceptional. It also made them dangerous. To themselves, and to what they were meant to be. The Wolfen curse was not spoken of freely, even within the Legion's own halls. It was the shadow of the Canis Helix, the dark side of the gift. The pull, in certain warriors, toward something older and less governed than the Astartes they had become. Toward the wolf rather than the man. Toward the feral thing that lived in the helix beneath the culture and the oaths and the careful architecture of civilization that the Legion wore over its wilder nature. The gift and the curse shared the same root. They always do. Volker Fenrica, true name. The Imperium has a talent for names. Official ones, properly recorded, filed in the appropriate administrative repositories, rendered in the correct formal Latin that the earliest architects of the great project favored as a gesture toward permanence and gravity. Leman had a talent for ignoring them. The 6th Legion was the Space Wolves. This was its name in the ledgers and the battle records and the formal communications that passed between the legions and the War Master's staff. It was accurate enough, and it served well enough for the purposes of people who needed to refer to the Legion without having to first understand it. But the Legion called itself something else. Volker Fenrica. The Wolves of Fenris in the Old Tongue, though the translation is imprecise, as translations of Fenrisian always are, the language being built for a world where precision was a luxury and feeling was a necessity. The full weight of it is closer to, "We who are the Wolves of Fenris," which carries in its construction a statement of identity rather than merely of origin. Leman insisted on this. He was, in many things, willing to compromise with the demands of the larger institution he served. He understood the necessity of the crusade, he understood the value of order, and he was not, whatever his reputation suggested, incapable of the longer strategic thought. But on this he did not bend. His sons would remember where they came from. They would carry the name of their home in the name they called themselves. You cannot understand a wolf by forgetting the world that made it. Human-wolf balance. There is a story told in the Legion's oldest halls. One of those stories that circulates not in the formal sagas but in the smaller hours of the night, passed between veterans, about a young warrior who made the mistake of suggesting, within Leman's hearing, that the Wolf King was more beast than man. The warrior was not punished. Leman did not rage or strike or make of the moment a lesson through violence, which he was certainly capable of should the occasion demand it. He simply looked at the young warrior for a long moment, with an expression the teller of the story is always careful to describe precisely, and then he said something quiet and walked away. What he said varies with the telling. The point does not. This was the misunderstanding that Leman spent a great deal of energy, quietly and without dramatics, correcting. He had been raised by wolves. He ran with wolves. He carried within him something of the wolf. In the Canis Helix that passed from his blood into the gene seed of his sons, in the affinity for the pack, in the particular relationship to hierarchy and loyalty and territory that the Fenrisians recognized and named and the wider Imperium sometimes found difficult to categorize. And he was a man. Fully, deliberately, consciously a man. He composed sagas. He negotiated rather than simply conquered. He observed the Uvucane rather than discarding it. He built something that lasted, which is a thoroughly human ambition, because wolves do not build for permanence. He was the bridge between the human and the wild. He stood on it by choice, and he faced the human shore. Nature of the Wolf King. Combat style. There are as many ways to lead men into battle as there are men who have tried it, and the histories of the Imperium are filled with their various approaches. The cold geometric precision of the Ultramarines, the siegecraft patience of the Iron Warriors, the lightning shock of the Emperor's children at their finest hour. Each legion carried the character of its Primarch into war, as surely as it carried his gene seed into its blood. Leman led as a pack leader leads. This is a simpler thing than it sounds, and a more complex thing than it appears. A pack is not a mob. It is not an undisciplined mass of violence pointed in a general direction and released. A pack has structure. Fluid, responsive, built on relationships of trust and demonstrated capability rather than formal rank and written order. Every member of the pack knows their role, not because they have been told it in a briefing room, but because they have run together long enough that the role has become instinct. Instinct was the word Leman returned to, again and again, in his councils and his sagas and his rare moments of explicit instruction. Trust your instincts. Develop them, feed them, test them. But when the moment comes and the ground shifts beneath the plan and the plan is suddenly a relic of a situation that no longer exists, trust your instincts. His warriors were trained to act without waiting for orders that the chaos of battle might prevent from arriving. Loyalty was the other word. The pack fights for one another, first and always. An army that fights for its brothers is harder to break than any fortification. Adaptable tactician. The reputation was the first thing people encountered, and it was vivid enough that many of them never looked past it. Leman of Fenris. The Wolf King, the savage, the Primarch who solved problems with his teeth and considered subtlety a weakness that other people had. The stories about him were full of direct action and immediate violence and the particular joy of the straightforward approach applied at maximum force. He encouraged these stories. He understood, with a clarity that was itself a form of strategic intelligence, that a reputation is a weapon, and a weapon should be kept sharp and ready to hand. Behind the reputation was a mind that his brother Primarchs, the ones who dealt with him long enough and honestly enough to see it, found quietly unsettling in its quality. He read terrain the way the rune priests read weather. As a text, full of information, requiring interpretation before it yielded its meaning. He understood logistics not as an abstraction but as a living system, full of pressures and vulnerabilities. He thought about the enemy not merely as an obstacle to be removed but as a problem to be understood, because a problem you understand is a problem you can solve with something better than brute force. He was, beneath the fur and the mead and the howling charges that the remembrancers love to document, a craftsman of war. He simply preferred that his enemies not know this. The wolf that appears to be merely charging in a straight line is usually not charging in a straight line. Strategic frontline role. A general who does not go where his soldiers go knows only half of what he needs to know. This was not a maxim Leman articulated in any formal document. The Space Wolves were not, as an institution, given to formal documents in the way that some legions were, maintaining libraries of tactical theory and annotated campaign histories. Their knowledge lived in the telling, in the saga, in the lesson passed from veteran to initiate around the fire. But the principle was there, embodied rather than written, demonstrated rather than declared. He fought at the front. Not because he was reckless. The adaptable tactician who lived beneath the Wolf King's reputation understood perfectly well the value of command elements that survived long enough to command. Not because he was careless of his own survival, but because he understood something about the nature of the warriors he led that made his presence at the front a tactical necessity rather than a personal indulgence. The Space Wolves fought harder when their Primarch was among them. This is true of all legions and their primarchs to some degree, but with the Volca Fenrica it was more immediate, more physical in its operation. Less about abstract inspiration and more about the pack instinct that the Canis Helix had threaded through them. When the pack leader was present, the pack cohered in a way it could not fully achieve through voxlink and tactical overlay. He was, himself, a force multiplier. His presence changed the mathematics of the engagement. The Wolf King did not lead from the rear. The rear was for those who had already fallen. Pack Howl Command. In the age before Voxbead and Tactical Cogitator and the elaborate communications architecture that the Crusade had developed to manage the coordination of armies across vast and complicated battlefields, men communicated in war through drum and horn and flag and, most anciently of all, through the voice. The voice carries further than most people remember, in the right conditions. On the open plains of Asaheim, in winter, a sound made with full force can travel distances that would surprise a man raised in enclosed and carpeted spaces. The wolves had always known this. Their howls were not expressions of emotion, or not merely expressions of emotion, but information, precisely encoded, passed across distances that made any other form of communication impossible. Leman had learned this young. His howl was a command system. This sounds, set down in plain terms, almost absurd. A Primarch coordinating the movements of a Space Marine Legion through vocalizations. But the reality of it in operation was something that observers on the right side of it found remarkable and observers on the wrong side of it found terrifying. The Volca Fenrica were trained to it from their earliest days as space wolves. Different calls carried different meanings. Flank, close, withdraw, hold, strike now. And the meanings were not consciously decoded so much as felt, operating at the level where the Canis Helix lived, below the rational mind, in the older and faster architecture of the brain that responds before thought catches up. On a battlefield obscured by smoke and ruin and the noise of 10,000 simultaneous acts of violence, the howl cut through everything. The pack heard its leader and it moved as one. Lupine sensory acuity. The world, for most men, is a narrow thing. They see what is in front of them, hear what is loud enough, smell what is close enough, and beyond those boundaries, the world simply does not exist for them until it arrives within range. This is not a criticism. It is a description of the equipment. Leman's equipment was different. His senses were those of the great wolves of Asaheim, refined and extended through the mechanisms of his Primarch physiology into something that had no adequate comparison in ordinary human experience. Smell for him was a language. Layered, complex, full of information that noses of ordinary construction could not begin to detect. He could smell the particular fear chemistry that a body produces under different kinds of stress, and distinguish between them. He could smell wounds, and their age, and sometimes their cause. He could track through conditions that would defeat any instrument not built by the most sophisticated artifice the Imperium could produce. His hearing extended into ranges that most species did not use for communication because most species could not reach them. Sounds that existed only as a kind of atmospheric texture for other beings resolved, for Leman, into discrete and meaningful signals. He heard hearts. He heard the specific tension of a muscle preparing to move. He heard things across distances that should have made hearing impossible. His sight in darkness was simply practical, a tool for a world that spent half its existence without sun. He did not experience the world as other men did. He experienced more of it. Rapid regeneration. The Primarchs were not made to die easily. This was, in the most literal sense, a design specification. Beings engineered at a level beyond any ordinary comprehension to serve as instruments of a project that required them to survive the unsurvivable on a sufficiently regular basis to make the project viable. But even among his brothers, Leman's capacity for regeneration was noted. Wounds that would have ended a Space Marine's ability to continue fighting, wounds that would have ended most other things' ability to continue existing. Leman sustained and continued. There are accounts in the campaign records, some clinical in their precision and some filtered through the inevitable awe of the witnesses, of damage received in close combat that should, by any reasonable physiological assessment, have required immediate extraction and extensive surgical intervention. He did not extract. He did not pause for surgical intervention. He continued. The mechanism was not fully understood, even by the apothecaries who attended the Legion and who had more access to the biological reality of the Primarch than almost any other individuals. The rate at which his tissues repaired themselves under active conditions, not resting, not in the controlled environment of a Medicae facility, but in the middle of the engagement, while further damage was being sustained, exceeded their models. What the warriors of the Volca Fenrica observed, and what became part of the accumulated lore of the Legion, was simpler. Their Primarch bled, and then he stopped bleeding, and then he fought harder. Pain was information. He noted it and moved on. Survival in a vacuum. There are environments that the human body treats as instant verdicts. Vacuum is one of them. The absence of atmosphere, the exposure to radiation unfiltered by any intervening medium, the temperature that is not cold so much as the complete absence of heat. These are not conditions. They are conclusions. The Primarchs were not fully human, and the environments that served as conclusions for human bodies served for them as merely difficult circumstances to be managed. Leman could fight in a vacuum. This is stated plainly in the accounts because there is no more elegant way to state it, and because the accounts themselves tend to state it plainly, with the slightly dazed quality of men who witnessed something that they understood was happening but could not fully accommodate within their existing framework of the possible. The physiology that enabled it was extraordinary even by the standards of transhumanity. Sealed systems that continued to function in the absence of external atmosphere, a tolerance for radiation that no ordinary biology could have produced, a capacity to maintain coherent action under thermal conditions that should have produced incapacity within seconds. He was not comfortable in vacuum. The accounts are clear that he did not appear to enjoy it, and he would not have chosen it as a preferred operating environment given the option of alternatives. But comfort was never the criterion. The criterion was capability, and capable he was. The galaxy is not made of breathable atmosphere. The crusade had to be taken to places that were. A weapon that only works in comfortable conditions is not much of a weapon. Immunity to aging. Time is the one great equalizer. The force that humbles kings and heroes alike, that reduces the extraordinary to the ordinary and the living to memory. The Fenrisians understood this as well as any people, perhaps better than most, living as they did in such intimate proximity to the evidence of impermanence. And yet, the Primarchs did not age. This was not a metaphor, not a poetic assertion of the kind that hero cults apply to their subjects after the fact to burnish a legacy. It was physiological fact. The cells did not carry the accumulated errors that time inscribes in ordinary biology, did not drift toward the entropy that even the healthiest human body is always, slowly, approaching. For Leman, on Fenris, this produced a particular quality of strangeness. The warriors who had followed him as young men aged. Their children aged. Their grandchildren were born into a world in which the Wolf King had been the Wolf King for their entire lifetimes, and their parents' lifetimes, and as far back as anyone could reliably remember, and in which he looked exactly as he had always looked. The same impossible size. The same quality of contained, patient energy. The same eyes. He watched generations pass beneath him like weather. There are accounts that suggest he found this difficult, in ways he did not often speak about directly. The pack instinct that was so deeply woven into him created bonds of particular intensity, and the bonds did not age with their other ends. He remained, they did not. Immortality is a different thing when you are paying attention to what it costs. The Emperor's executioner. Not all work done in service of a great cause is glorious work. The Great Crusade was, in its grandest telling, a work of reunion. The scattered peoples of humanity gathered back under a single banner, brought back into contact with one another after the long darkness of the age of strife, offered the light of reason and the protection of unified strength. This is how the remembrancers wrote of it. This is how the iterators spoke of it on newly compliant worlds, standing in the rubble of whatever had previously occupied the space where imperial civilization was now being erected. The grand telling was true, as far as it went. It did not go all the way. The practical reality of building an empire across the stars is that not every world chooses to be gathered. Not every ruler greets the arriving fleet with open arms and a willingness to discuss the terms of a compliance that will require surrendering the sovereignty they have spent generations defending. Not every empire encountered is willing to simply step aside. And within the Crusade's own vast structure, not every commander remained loyal to its principles as the years stretched into decades and the power available to any given legion became, in certain minds, a temptation that the original vision had not fully accounted for. These situations required resolution. The emperor looked at his sons. The full range of them, their characters and capabilities and the particular qualities that made each of them what they were. And for the work of resolution, he looked most often at Leman. Some tasks require a weapon. Some require a particular kind of weapon. The reputation spread as reputations do, faster than the events that earned it. Worlds that had received the imperial emissaries and found the terms of compliance generous enough, on reflection, to accept. Those worlds heard about the Volca Fenrica at a comfortable remove, as one hears about weather systems in other regions. Interesting. Notable. Not personally relevant. Worlds that were considering resistance heard about them differently. They heard the specific names of places where resistance had been considered and abandoned after the space wolves arrived. They heard descriptions of the Legion in operation. Not the sanitized accounts that official remembrances produced for general circulation, but the rougher, more accurate versions that travel along the informal channels that soldiers and traders and refugees have always maintained. What those descriptions communicated, consistently and across the variety of sources that produced them, was this. The space wolves came when the Emperor was finished being patient. Their arrival was not a new opening of negotiations. It was the notification that negotiations had closed. This made them feared in a way that differed from the fear inspired by legions of more obvious and theatrical lethality. The wolves were not a spectacle of destruction deployed to overawe. They were a consequence, specific and personal, dispatched in response to a specific and personal failure. Their reputation preceded them as a form of leverage. Worlds that might have held out against a conventional assault sometimes did not hold out against the knowledge that Leman Russ had been sent. The Emperor's patience was a gift. Its end was not. Dulan Campaign. The King of Dulan had made his feelings about the Imperium known in terms that left very little room for interpretive charity. The specifics of the insult have been recorded in various accounts with varying degrees of completeness, but the core of it is consistent. He had been given the opportunity to comply, to accept the terms that the Crusade extended to worlds that chose wisdom over pride, and he had refused in a manner calculated not merely to reject the offer but to insult the authority behind it. He had, in short, made the mistake of treating the Emperor's patience as though it were inexhaustible. The space wolves were dispatched. The Dulan campaign is not among the most celebrated of the Great Crusade's engagements. It was not a long campaign, and length is one of the things that tends to generate the kind of detail that remembrancers require for their more elaborate productions. It was, rather, a campaign of considerable efficiency. The Iron Citadel, which the King of Dulan had perhaps imagined would make the question of compliance academic by making compliance impossible to enforce, proved to be less decisive a factor than its builders had hoped. Leman led the assault himself, at the front, as he always was. not delegating the breach to subordinates while he managed the overall operation from a position of appropriate safety, but present at the point of decision, where the fighting was thickest and the outcome was being determined by the actions of individuals rather than the movements of formations. The citadel fell. The king of Dulan learned, at the end, that fortifications are only as strong as the will behind them. The Temple of Lies battle. There are those who believe that a ruler who hides behind the sacred places of his people has, in the hiding, already conceded the argument. Leman was among them. The temple, called in the accounts, the Temple of Lies, though whether this was its original name or a designation applied after the fact by those who had no sympathy for what had been worshipped there is not entirely clear, was the final refuge of Dulan's king. He had retreated there when the iron citadel fell, surrounded himself with the last of his household guard, and apparently decided that the weight of whatever sanctity the place carried would either deter the final assault or at least complicate it sufficiently to allow for some other resolution. It deterred nothing. Leman stormed the temple personally. The accounts of those who witnessed it from the Space Wolf side of the engagement described the assault with the same slightly awed plainness that characterizes many of the more extreme accounts of the Wolf King in action. A recitation of events in which the writer's apparent intention is simple documentation, and the ore leaks through anyway because the events resist neutral description. He went in. He found the king. He removed the king's capacity to continue being a problem, in the most direct and permanent manner available. The manner was beheading, which on Fenris carries a specific significance beyond the merely practical. It is the end that is given to a foe who has been judged and found wanting, a verdict rendered in the physical rather than the administrative register. The Temple of Lies housed one fewer lie after that morning. The Pale Hunters Campaign. Not all of the executioner's work was done against humanity's own. The galaxy in the age of the Great Crusade was occupied, in ways that the crusade itself was in the business of addressing. Some species retreating before the advance of the Imperium, some negotiating arrangements of various kinds, and some simply fighting, because fighting was what they did, or because the alternative on offer was not, from their perspective, meaningfully different from defeat by other means. The Pale Hunters were of the last category. They were a xenospecies. The details of their biology and civilization preserved in the campaign records with the particular sparse quality that such records tend to have when the compilers are primarily interested in the military aspects of the encounter. What is clear is that they were capable, organized, and disinclined toward accommodation. They had a king, or something that functioned as a king, which the records call the Pale King. Again, a designation that may reflect the original title or may simply be the translation the Crusade's interpreters settled on for something that did not map neatly into imperial categories. Leman killed him in personal combat. The accounts of the combat itself are more detailed than the surrounding campaign, because the surrounding campaign was a military operation and the personal combat was a story, and the Space Wolves understood the difference in a way that their record-keeping reflects. It was brutal, as the Wolf King's personal combats tended to be. Not ugly, but without the aesthetic flourishes that some Primarchs brought to individual engagement. Efficiency was its own kind of beauty on Fenris. Thunderwolf Mount Skjorn. He had ridden wolves before. This is the context that the accounts sometimes fail to provide. That the image of Leman Russ mounted on a thunderwolf, which to outside observers appeared a spectacle of almost deliberate excess, was to the man himself simply a return to an earlier and entirely natural mode of operation. He had grown up running with the great direwolves of Asaheim. He had, as a youth, subdued Fang and inherited the pack. The relationship between the Wolf King and the wolves of his world was older and deeper than his relationship with almost anything else. Skjorn was a thunderwolf. One of the enormous creatures of Asaheim's plains, scaled to proportions that made even the transhuman bulk of an Astartes look reasonably sized by comparison. The name means, in the Old Fenrisian, something approximating, the one who remembers, though the translation loses the specific quality of the memory implied, which in the original carries a connotation of grudges held across generations. In battle, mounted, Leman became a different order of problem for opposing forces. The mass of the thunderwolf added to the mass of the Primarch produced an impact on contact that the physics of the situation made essentially unpleasant for whatever was being contacted. More than the physical reality, though, was the signal it sent. That this was not merely a powerful warrior but a force of nature in the most literal sense, something that the world of Fenris had produced and equipped and sent out into the galaxy with its full intention behind it. Skjorn ran. The ground reported the fact to everything standing on it. Brawler nickname. The servants of chaos have their own records, of a kind, preserved in ways that do not always translate cleanly into forms that the Imperium scholars can access or fully credit, but present nonetheless in the accumulated lore of those who have studied the enemy with the specific attention that understanding an enemy requires. In those records, Leman Russ appears under various designations. Some of them are curses. Some of them are warnings, of the practical kind, that experienced soldiers pass on to those who will come after them. And some of them are, in their own way, something close to respect. The one that persisted, the one that appears most consistently across the various sources, was simple. The Brawler. It is worth sitting with this for a moment, because it tells you something interesting about what the forces of chaos found notable about him. They had faced other Primarchs. They had their names for those Primarchs too, names that reflected the qualities that made each one dangerous in their own particular way. The strategist. The relentless one. The beautiful destroyer. For Leman, they reached for Brawler. And in reaching for it, they revealed something. That what they remembered most, what lodged most durably in the collective experience of those who had faced him, was not the tactics or the strategy or the pack coordination or any of the more technically sophisticated aspects of his approach to warfare. It was the immediate, personal, relentless, up-close nature of his violence. The sense, facing him, of something that was not going to be deterred or confused or misdirected. The Brawler came to the fight and stayed in it until the fight was finished. That was all. It was enough. Brothers and rivalries. Brotherly admiration for Horus. There are 18 brothers, and no two relationships among them are the same. This is the nature of large families. That the connections between their members are not uniform, not interchangeable, but specific, shaped by the particular qualities that each individual brings to the meeting and the particular resonance that occurs when those qualities encounter another's. Some brothers are strangers who happen to share blood. Some are rivals. Some are, in the fullest sense, kin. Not merely in the biological record but in the felt reality of kinship, the sense of recognition that crosses the gap between separate lives and says, "You, I know." For Leman, that recognition fell most completely on Horus. He admired him in the way that younger brothers admire elder brothers who have made a success of the things the younger brother also cares about. Not the cold admiration of a subordinate for a superior, not the calculated respect of one commander for another's demonstrated capability, but something warmer and less guarded than either of those things. Horus was what a Primarch could be at its finest expression. The Crusades' war master, the Emperor's most beloved son, a warrior and a leader and a diplomat of extraordinary range. Leman watched him and saw a standard worth measuring oneself against. He was not naive about Horus. The Wolf King's ability to read people was too well developed for naivety. But he trusted what he saw, in the years before the trust became the most expensive thing he had ever extended. The oldest wound is the one made by someone you loved well. Respect for Rogel Dorn. They were not similar men. Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists was a man of stone. Not in the pejorative sense, not in the sense of coldness or inflexibility of mind, but in the sense of absolute solidity. He was reliable in the way that a mountain is reliable. Present, immovable, the same tomorrow as it was today. He built things. He defended things. He understood the geometry of fortification and the mathematics of siege with the same native fluency that Leman understood the wind and the track. Where Leman was instinct, Dorn was structure. Where Leman ran toward the point of contact, Dorn built the conditions that made contact occur on his terms. Where Leman's counsels were animated and loud and occasionally resolved by the slamming of large fists on surfaces, Dorn's were methodical, thorough, and produced documents. They disagreed regularly and on matters of substance, about how wars ought to be conducted. And Leman respected him. Genuinely, without reservation, in the particular way that he tended to respect things that were so fully and unapologetically themselves that no argument could be made against the integrity of the position even when you disagreed with its conclusions. Dorn never pretended to be something he was not. He never reached for a style of leadership that was not native to him. He was Rogel Dorn all the way to the bone, and if that made him occasionally difficult to work alongside, it also made him exactly what he said he was. On a world of ice and deception, consistency was the rarest virtue. The Lions' friendly rivalry. This one was different. The admiration for Horus was reverent. The respect for Dorn was considered. But with Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels, the Primarch of the First Legion, what existed between them was something more alive and less easily categorized, a rivalry that generated heat rather than distance, a competition that neither of them would fully admit to and neither of them would abandon. They were, beneath the obvious differences of culture and temperament and legion, more similar than either cared to acknowledge. Both had been found wild. Leman by the wolves and the Fenrisian tribes, the lion by the forests of Caliban, raised outside the structures of conventional human society, and bearing in their character the permanent mark of that upbringing. Both were exceptional warriors in a cohort of exceptional warriors, which meant that the question of relative standing was one that their instincts raised even when their reason would have preferred to leave it alone. They tested each other. Constantly, and with a creativity that suggested genuine investment in the project. Contests of strength. Contests of endurance. Arguments about tactics that were simultaneously genuine tactical arguments and proxies for the larger unmapped competition that ran beneath them. Hunts. Wagers. The elaborate and slightly dangerous social rituals that occur when two apex predators occupy the same territory and have decided, for the moment, not to resolve the question through outright conflict. Neither won definitively. This, perhaps, was the point. Some rivalries are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to keep both parties sharp. Oath to Vulcan. Not all bonds between brothers were built from competition or admiration or the friction of differing philosophies grinding against one another in the councils of the crusade. Some were built from something simpler and older. Shared values, recognized across the distance between two very different lives, producing the sudden and uncomplicated certainty that here was someone whose word meant what it said. Vulcan of the Salamanders was that. The Primarch of the 18th Legion was a different kind of warrior. A maker as much as a fighter, a man who bent his considerable intelligence toward the protection of the ordinary people in whose name the crusade was ostensibly conducted, who did not lose sight of the human cost of the great project in the way that some of his brothers could, over the long years of the campaign, begin to do. He was warm, in a way that the word does not fully capture. Not soft, not naive, but genuinely and consistently oriented toward the preservation of life rather than merely the accumulation of victories. Leman looked at him and recognized something. A pack protects its own. Not as a strategic calculation, not as a doctrine to be applied when convenient, but as the first and most basic obligation of the strong toward the vulnerable. Vulcan understood this without needing it explained. He had understood it long before the language of the pack was applied to it. The blood oath they forged was not a political arrangement. It was a recognition. two men who had arrived, by entirely different paths, at the same essential understanding of what strength was for. A blade that does not protect is merely a blade. It is the hand behind it that gives it meaning. Mockery of Lorgar. There are disagreements of strategy, and disagreements of temperament, and disagreements of philosophy. And then there are the disagreements that are not really disagreements at all, but simply the irreconcilable encounter between two entirely different understandings of what the universe is and what a person's obligations within it are. Leman's relationship with Lorgar Aurelian of the Word Bearers was the last kind. Lorgar preached. This was his nature, his compulsion, the activity that gave shape and meaning to everything else he did. The finding of the divine, the articulation of its significance, the conversion of others to the understanding he had arrived at and could not keep to himself. He had begun by preaching the divinity of the emperor, and the emperor had corrected him, sharply and in a manner designed to be remembered. He had then redirected his considerable theological energies elsewhere. Leman had no patience for any of it. This was not, on his part, a sophisticated philosophical position, carefully reasoned and elegantly articulated. It was something more immediate. The instinctive response of a man raised on a world where survival was the first theology and the second was loyalty, and there was very little room in the hierarchy for anything that couldn't pull its weight in a blizzard. He mocked Lorgar. Directly, publicly, with the particular edge that Fenrisian humor carries when it is not being polite. Which is to say, most of the time. Whether he sensed what was growing in his brother beneath the preaching, none of the accounts say. The wolf that cannot smell the rot has not lost its nose. It has simply chosen not to follow where the scent leads. Rejection of Ferrus. Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands was a Primarch of extraordinary capability and a philosophy that Leman found, at the most fundamental level, wrong. The Iron Hands believed in the replacement of the weak with the strong. And by weak, they meant flesh, and by strong, they meant metal. The body was fallible. The machine was reliable. The path toward perfection ran through the progressive substitution of one for the other, until whatever remained could be trusted to perform its function without the inconvenience of biological variability. Ferrus had offered Leman a gift. This was not unusual amongst the Primarchs. They exchanged gifts as a form of relationship, a language of regard conducted in objects of significance rather than words. Ferrus's gifts tended to be things he had made, which was appropriate, because making things was the purest expression of who he was. The gift was cybernetic. Leman smashed it. The accounts record the moment with varying degrees of diplomatic softening, but the core of it does not vary. He received the gift, understood what it was and what it implied about what Ferrus thought his brother might benefit from, and destroyed it. Not in rage. Or not primarily in rage. But as a statement, delivered in the register that Fenrisians considered most direct and therefore most honest. He was a man. His flesh was his flesh. The wolf that his blood carried was not a deficiency to be corrected. He bore Ferrus no lasting ill will. The rejection was complete, but it was not cruel. A gift that asks you to be less than yourself is not a gift. Feud with Perturabo. Some feuds are born from a single incident. Others accumulate, layer by layer, across many meetings and many campaigns and many councils, until the weight of it becomes self-sustaining. Each new disagreement reading differently because of the ones that came before, each encounter colored by the last. The feud between Leman and Perturabo of the Iron Warriors was the second kind. Perturabo was a siege master. Perhaps the greatest the Imperium had produced, a theorist and practitioner of the taking and defending of fortified positions whose understanding of the relevant mathematics was so complete that it had become something close to art. He planned with exhaustive precision. He measured his operations in stages and contingencies and carefully managed variables. He was not comfortable with chaos, in the small c sense of the word, with the way that the actual conduct of war has an irreducible tendency to diverge from its planning. Leman was, in many respects, a walking embodiment of that tendency. Their strategic approaches clashed at every level of abstraction. Where Perturabo built careful approaches, Leman exploited sudden vulnerabilities. Where Perturabo managed his forces as components of a system, Leman trusted his warriors to respond as individuals to developing situations. Where Perturabo believed that enough preparation made an outcome inevitable, Leman believed that inevitability was a story you told after the fact about something that had been genuinely uncertain at the time. Neither was wrong exactly. They were simply describing different kinds of war. Two methods, both effective, both convinced the other was a waste of time. The councils were long. Contempt for Guilliman. Roboute Guilliman of the Ultramarines was, by almost any objective measure, one of the most accomplished Primarchs of the Crusade. A builder of systems, an administrator of extraordinary competence, a military theorist whose work would eventually become the foundational text of the Adeptus Astartes for 10,000 years. Leman found him exhausting. The contempt, and it was contempt, though it was not without a grudging substrate of acknowledged capability, was specific in its target. It was not Guilliman's intelligence that Leman objected to, nor his effectiveness, nor even the ambitious scope of his vision for what the Imperium could be as a functioning political entity. These things Leman could respect, at a sufficient distance. It was the logistics. Guilliman talked about logistics the way that some men talk about religion. With a comprehensive conviction that this was the foundation on which everything else rested, the sacred infrastructure without which all other endeavor was ultimately futile. He was, moreover, not wrong about this, which made the conversations harder to escape. Supply chains and administrative structures and the proper codification of tactical doctrine are not exciting topics, and Guilliman's ability to become genuinely animated about them was something that Leman experienced as a kind of endurance test. He mocked it. He mocked it to Guilliman's face, and to others, and in the creative and specific terms available to a man of Fenrisian wit, operating in a target-rich environment. Guilliman absorbed the mockery with the patience of a man who knew he was right and could afford to wait. The wolf mocks the tortoise. The tortoise builds the civilization. The clash with Angron. The Knight of the Wolf is not a name that appears in the official records of the Great Crusade with any particular prominence. It is a name that lives in the Legion's own memory, and in whatever passes for memory in the World Eaters, who recorded their history in a different and less legible medium. What happened was this. Angron, Primarch of the 12th Legion, had been doing what Angron did, which was to say, consuming his legion in a war of attrition against their own capacity for restraint, driving them toward something that those who were paying attention could see was not going to end well, and resisting every attempt by his brothers to discuss the matter with the focused hostility of a man who had been in pain for so long that he could no longer distinguish between the pain and himself. Leman intervened. This was not, universally, considered wise. What followed is described as a duel, though the word implies a structure and a formality that the accounts do not entirely support. It was a fight. Personal, direct, the kind of encounter that happens when two beings of equivalent and extraordinary capability decide that the matter between them needs to be resolved in the oldest available register. It ended without resolution. This is the honest account of it. Not a victory for either, not a defeat for either, but a cessation, reached at some point after the mutual damage had accumulated to a level that made continuation a question of pride rather than purpose. Leman walked away. So did Angron. Some arguments cannot be won. Sometimes the point is simply to have made them. The hatred of psychers. There are fears that are irrational, born from ignorance or superstition or the simple human tendency to recoil from what is not understood. And then there are fears that are entirely rational. Fears that have looked at the evidence carefully and arrived at their conclusion through a process that would survive scrutiny. Leman's distrust of sorcery and the warp-touched was the second kind. He had grown up on Fenris, where the boundary between the material world and whatever lay beyond it was thinner than on most worlds, where the rune priests walked that boundary as a professional obligation and where the consequences of walking it carelessly were not theoretical but immediate and visible and frequently fatal. He had undergone the trial of Morkai. He had made, if the legends are to be credited, his own arrangement with what lived at the threshold. He was not ignorant of the warp. He was, in some ways, more directly acquainted with it than many of his brothers who had never had cause to look at it closely. And what he had seen, looking closely, was this: that the power was real, and that the price was real, and that the price was not always paid by the person who had accepted the bargain. This was the heart of it. Not a simple revulsion from the uncanny. He had spent his life in the company of the uncanny, on a world that produced it abundantly. But a specific and reasoned objection to power that came from a place that wanted something in return, that left a mark on everything it touched, that had a direction of its own beneath the direction of the person wielding it. The warp does not give. It lends, and it remembers what is owed. The library dispute with Magnus. Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns was the most gifted psyker among the Primarchs, perhaps the most gifted psyker the species had produced, in an age that was beginning, cautiously and with considerable institutional anxiety, to acknowledge that such gifts existed and required management rather than simple suppression. He was also, by most accounts, a man of genuine and expansive intellectual curiosity, a collector of knowledge in the way that certain minds cannot help but be drawn to the unknown not from ambition alone but from the particular compulsion of the intelligence that finds ignorance genuinely painful and understanding genuinely pleasurable. The library was an expression of this. A repository of knowledge that Magnus had accumulated across the years of the Crusade. Texts and records and preserved learnings from worlds and civilizations that the Crusade had encountered, some of which would not survive the encounter in a form capable of preserving their own histories. He considered it a service. A salvage operation conducted at civilizational scale. Leman considered some of what it contained a hazard. The specific incident, what was said, what was done, who moved first in the escalating sequence of events that produced the outcome, is told differently by those who were present, which is usually a sign that the truth of it is uncomfortable to all parties. What is consistent across the tellings is the result. That knowledge was destroyed, that Magnus experienced this as a violation of something sacred, and that the boundary between the two brothers, which had always been tense given their opposed natures, hardened into something less easily crossed. You cannot burn what a man loves and expect him to remember only the warmth. The enmity from the library clash. Forgiveness is a complicated thing among ordinary men. Among beings of the particular magnitude and memory of the Primarchs, it becomes more complicated still, because the capacity for feeling is not diminished by the transhuman body that contains it, and the memory does not fade with the passage of years in the way that ordinary human memory, mercifully, tends to do. Magnus did not forget. This requires some understanding of what the library had meant to him, which was not merely a collection of objects, however valuable, however irreplaceable. It was a life's work, in a life that had been devoted to the proposition that knowledge was the highest good, that understanding was worth any cost, that the accumulation of what was known and the preservation of what might otherwise be lost was a sacred obligation that justified the risks it required. Leman had looked at that life's work and seen a threat. Had acted on that assessment in the direct and unequivocal manner that was his characteristic mode. Had not, the accounts suggest, spent a great deal of time on apology or extended explanation afterward, because in his reckoning, the matter had been clear, the action had been necessary, and the conversation was therefore concluded. For Magnus, the conversation was not concluded. It had, in some ways, only just begun. What grew between them after, the cold distance, The formal courtesy that was colder than open hostility would have been, the sense of an account that had been opened and never settled, would cast a long shadow. The galaxy would eventually provide circumstances in which old enmities found new and terrible expression. What is not resolved does not disappear. It waits. The burning of Prospero order. There are moments in the histories of great institutions when a single decision, made in a particular context by people operating with incomplete information, produces consequences so vast and so permanent that the original decision becomes almost impossible to evaluate fairly afterward, because the consequences have grown so large that they obscure the moment itself. The order regarding Magnus and Prospero was such a moment. What the Emperor intended, the scholars and remembrancers and legion historians have argued across the long years since, with the particular energy that arguments attract when the stakes are retrospectively enormous and the principles are no longer available for clarification. The order was to bring Magnus to account for the transgression of the Council of Nicaea, where the use of sorcery within the legions had been debated and ruled upon, and which Magnus had subsequently violated in a manner so flagrant that it could not be ignored without rendering the ruling meaningless. To bring to account is a phrase with range. It admits of interpretations from the relatively gentle to the absolute, and where exactly on that range the Emperor's intention sat is precisely what the argument has always been about. Leman received the order. He interpreted it. The interpretation he arrived at was not the gentle end of the range. Whether this was the correct reading of the Emperor's intent, or a misreading shaped by his own feelings about sorcery and its practitioners, or something darker, a manipulation, a heretical hand moving between the sender and the recipient, altering the meaning in transit, is the question that the burning of Prospero will never fully answer. An order misread is still an order carried out. The ash does not care about the intention. Horus Heresy Roll. The fleet moved through the void toward Prospero, and the void did not offer any opinion on the matter. This is the nature of space, that it provides no resistance to what passes through it, no friction of conscience or geography, none of the natural obstacles that terrestrial campaigns generate and that sometimes, in generating, allow a moment of pause that changes what happens next. The fleet moved, and the distance closed, and the planet grew in the forward observation ports from a point of light to a disk to a world. Prospero was a world of extraordinary beauty. The accounts from those who had visited it in better times describe a planet of ancient cities and accumulated learning, a civilization that had made of knowledge its defining characteristic and of its greatest city a monument to what an intellect could build when given sufficient time and freedom to build it. Leman saw it as a military problem, and solved it as a military problem. He led the assault himself, as he always led. At the front, in the thick of it, where the fighting was thickest and the cost was most immediate. The Thousand Sons were not an easy enemy. They were Astartes, gene-crafted warriors of the same fundamental stock as the Space Wolves, enhanced and trained and hardened in the same crucible of the Crusade. And they fought with something more than bolter and blade. They fought with the gifts that their Primarch had cultivated in them, the warp-touched powers that Leman despised, and had always despised. He fought through it. He fought through all of it. The Wolf King did not pause at the gates of Prospero. He opened them. Refusal of Custodes' aid. The Legio Custodes were present. This is a fact the accounts do not obscure. The Emperor's own guardians, those 10,000 warriors who stood closest to the master of mankind and whose capabilities exceeded even the Astartes in ways that the Astartes were careful not to discuss too publicly, had made the journey to Prospero. They offered to fight alongside the Space Wolves. Leman refused. The refusal has generated considerable commentary across the years, ranging from the tactical, that the integration of the Custodes into the Wolves' assault would have complicated the pack coordination that was the Legion's primary operational strength, to the personal, which is the interpretation that sits most comfortably with what is known of the Wolf King's character. This was his operation. his order, his responsibility, his legion's work. The presence of the custodes alongside them would have divided the burden and, in dividing it, would have divided something that Leman believed should not be divided. The accountability. If Prospero burned, and it was going to burn, the decision had been made and the fleet was already there, then the burning should belong to the hands that carried it out, without the diffusion that comes from shared action. He was, in this, accepting the full weight of what he had been sent to do. Whether this was honor or pride or something else entirely, the accounts do not resolve. Perhaps Leman himself could not have fully separated the three. A wolf does not share the kill it did not invite another wolf to make. The reckoning belongs to the hunter. The rune-etched talisman. The rune priests of Fenris occupy a particular and carefully maintained position within the space wolves. Acknowledged, valued, given their place in the legion's structure and culture, and simultaneously held at a certain distance from the full warmth of the pack's embrace. They are what they are. The legion knows what they are. And the legion, shaped by its Primarch's convictions, regards what they are with the specific complicated mixture of respect and wariness that Leman had always modeled in his own relationship with the shamanic tradition he had encountered in his youth. They were not sorcerers. This distinction mattered enormously to Leman, and he maintained it with a consistency that suggested genuine conviction rather than convenient categorization. The rune priests read what was already written in the world, in the wind, in the ice, in the movements of the Fenrisian sky. They did not reach into the warp and take from it. They listened, and interpreted, and channeled what was there. This is what Leman told himself. The distinction held, or held well enough. At Prospero, a talisman was used, rune-etched, prepared by the priests in the shamanic tradition that stretched back to Fenris and to the practices that predated the Legion itself. What it called, or unlocked, or gave shape to, was a storm. It rolled across Prospero's sky above the fighting, above the burning cities and the clashing warriors, a meteorological violence that disrupted the Thousand Suns operations and drove the ash in great choking walls through the streets of Magnus's great city. The Wolf King despised sorcery. He was, it should be said, very careful about what he called sorcery. Leman Russ versus Magnus. There are battles within battles. The vast machinery of a military engagement, with its formations and its objectives and its measured movements across prepared ground, containing within itself countless smaller and more personal violences. Most of these smaller violences are not remembered. They are the texture of the thing, the substance of what war actually is beneath the clean lines of the maps that are drawn afterward. And then there are the encounters that are not texture but event, moments within the larger moment that carry a weight of their own, that the outcome of the surrounding engagement cannot fully contain or explain, that demand to be understood on their own terms. The duel between Leman Russ and Magnus the Red was such an encounter. They came together amid the burning of the city that Magnus had built. The city that had been his life's expression, his argument made architectural, his demonstration that knowledge and beauty and the careful cultivation of the mind's highest capacities could produce something worth protecting. It was burning now, and the burning was Leman's work, and Magnus knew this, and Leman knew that Magnus knew this, and neither of them required any further establishment of the stakes. Magnus fought with everything he was. This must be said plainly and without qualification, because to diminish it would be to diminish what followed. A great psyker, perhaps the greatest the species had produced, a Primarch in the full expression of his power, fighting on the soil of his home for everything he had made and everything he believed. The warp responded to him. The air between them was not simply air. Reality, in the immediate vicinity of their engagement, expressed its discomfort with the situation in visible and dramatic terms. The city burned around them. They did not notice the city. When giants meet, the ground beneath them is the first casualty. It ended, as such things end, not with a single decisive stroke that the histories can point to and say, "Here, this was the moment." but with the accumulation of a contest in which one combatant proved, by the slow and terrible arithmetic of sustained violence, to be more than the other could answer. Leman was not the more powerful being in the technical sense. Or perhaps he was, in the ways that mattered most when the warp fire had been spent and the shields of psychic force had been tested to their limit, and what remained was the older and more fundamental question of which of them could continue and which could not. He was, in his bones and his blood, and the thing that Fenris had made of him before any of this had been imagined, a predator. Not a scholar who could fight. Not a strategist who was also a warrior. A predator, first and last, with everything else built around that fact. He broke Magnus's spine. The accounts state this with the plainness that the accounts reserve for things that resist elaboration. The physical reality of it too stark, the implications too large, the moment too final in its quality to benefit from the additions that storytelling usually provides. He broke his brother's spine. Magnus, the Crimson King, the most gifted of them all, the builder of the city that was burning around them. Leman took him apart in the oldest way available, with the strength that no amount of psychic power had ultimately been able to answer. Magnus did not die. The warp received him. Opened, as it will, for those who have given it sufficient of themselves, and took him into whatever passage leads from the material world to the places beyond it that have no coordinates a navigator can find. He was gone. The city burned. The space wolves stood in the ash of Prospero and the duel was over, and nothing that had been broken could be put back together. Leman had won. He stood in the ruins of his victory, and the word for what he felt has never been satisfactorily recorded. The Wolf King in the Horus Heresy. The Shadow Vision Curse. The warp does not leave clean wounds. This is one of the things that Leman had always known, had known from the trial of Morkai, from the long acquaintance with the rune priests and their careful navigation of the boundary between what was material and what was not, from the accumulated wisdom of a people who had lived for generations in proximity to something vast and hungry and not entirely asleep. The warp takes, and what it takes does not always have a name, and the taking is not always immediate. Sometimes it is slow, a gradual alteration of something interior that the person experiencing it is the last to fully see. Prospero had cost him something. He knew this. The visions came in the way that such things tend to come. Not in the dramatic revelation of the saga tradition, not as clear and legible messages from whatever intelligence might be shaping them, but as impressions, fragmentary and non-linear, arriving in the thin hours between sleeping and waking when the mind's ordinary defenses are relaxed. He saw faces. He saw betrayals in their specific and personal detail. Not the broad shape of the heresy, which was already visible to anyone paying attention, but the particular moments of turning, the specific faces of men he had trusted in the act of becoming men he could not trust. He did not speak of this widely. The Wolf King who despised the warp and its workings had been marked by the warp. There was an irony in it that he was not likely to have found amusing, and a vulnerability in it that he would not have chosen to display. He carried the visions as he carried everything difficult. Internally, and forward. The wolf that has been wounded does not show the wound to the pack. It runs harder. Leaving terror for fleet hunt. Terror, in those days, was becoming what it had not been before. A fortress, a redoubt, the last fixed point in a galaxy that was coming apart along seams that nobody had known existed until they began to tear. The Emperor was on the golden throne. The great work of the siege was taking its shape, and the shape was a terrible one, and the men and women who understood what was coming were making their preparations with the particular focused calm of people who have accepted a situation without having accepted defeat. Leman did not stay. This requires some understanding of who he was and what staying would have cost him. Not in any abstract or reputational sense, but in the immediate physical and psychological reality of his nature. He was a hunter. He was a pack leader. He was the being that Fenris had produced when it had decided to produce something for going after things that needed to be gone after. And Horus was out there, moving through the galaxy at the head of the forces that had broken the Crusade, the brother that Leman had loved and admired, and been, in the end, unable to see clearly until the seeing was too late. He left Terra to hunt. The decision was not universally applauded. There were those who believed his strength was needed at Terra, that the siege would determine everything, and that forces spent elsewhere were forces spent on the secondary. They were not entirely wrong. But Leman was not built for walls. He was not built for waiting behind fortifications while the thing he was built to pursue moved freely through the dark. You cannot cage a wolf for its own protection. It will simply destroy the cage. The Alax's Nebula ambush. The hunt did not go as hunts sometimes do not go. Which is to say, the prey had been given warning, or had always been more aware of the hunter than the hunter had assumed, or had arranged the terrain in ways that transformed the expected shape of the encounter into something else entirely. The Alax's Nebula was a place that the navigational records described in the cautious language that records use for regions where the light behaves in ways that interfere with reliable observation. A region of gas and dust and electromagnetic interference that made the reading of space difficult and the planning of movements through it a matter of estimation rather than precision. It was, in other words, excellent ground for an ambush. Horus's allies had prepared. The forces that fell upon Russ's fleet in the depths of the Alax's Nebula were not a casual interception. They had been positioned, and the positioning reflected an understanding of where the space wolves were going and why. Someone had read the hunt correctly and arranged to be between the hunter and the quarry. The engagement that followed was brutal in the specific way that space combat becomes brutal when the conditions strip away the advantages of superior positioning and superior intelligence, and reduce the matter to the simpler question of which side can sustain more damage and continue to function. The space wolves were hurt. Badly, by the standards of what it took to meaningfully damage a space marine legion in full deployment. Ships were lost. Warriors were lost. The fleet that had left Terra to run down the War Master emerged from the Alax's Nebula diminished. The hunter had been hunted. He noted it, and adjusted. Rafnkal flagship. Every commander needs a center. A place from which the threads of an operation can be gathered and read and acted upon, a fixed point in the organized chaos of a campaign from which decisions can be made with the best available picture of what is happening. For the Space Wolves, that center was the Rafnkal. The battle barge was named for a figure of Fenrisian legend. A warrior of the old sagas, the details of whose story vary with the telling but whose name carries connotations of stubbornness and endurance and the particular quality of those who continue past the point where continuance seems reasonable. It was an appropriate name for a flagship. The Rafnkal was not merely a vessel of war, though it was formidably that. It was, for the duration of the heresy campaign, the closest thing the Space Wolves had to a home. The place where the Legion's command structure operated, where the rune priests conducted their observations, where the sagas of the ongoing campaign were being composed even as the campaign unfolded, in the tradition of a people who had always believed that the story and the event were simultaneous rather than sequential. Leman commanded from it as he commanded everything. From proximity to the thing itself, with a directness that the more elaborate command arrangements of other legions sometimes found difficult to interface with. His style of command did not require the full apparatus of the strategium in the way that a more administratively oriented Primarch might have needed it. He needed the ship to be where the fighting was. The Rafnkal took him there. A wolf's den is not a place of retreat. It is a place of return. Isgraven Nebula painting. There are things a person does when the official channels for processing experience are insufficient. When the visions are too strange and the feelings are too large and the language of the saga tradition, capacious as it is, does not quite reach the interior of what is being undergone. Leman painted. This is not widely recorded in the formal accounts, and was apparently not widely known even within the Legion. A private practice, conducted in the hours that a Primarch technically did not need for sleep but sometimes took anyway, in whatever space aboard the Raffenkel he had designated as his own. The murals he produced during the long transit through the Isgraven Nebula were not decorative. They were not, in any conventional sense, aesthetic exercises. They were the visions. Given form, given color, given the permanence of paint on a surface, because perhaps the act of externalizing them made them more manageable, turned them from things that happened to him, in the privacy of his own sleeping mind, into things he could stand in front of and look at, and in looking at, achieve some small degree of the distance that the rune priests called wisdom. They were prophetic, or appeared to be. Images that those who later saw them found uncomfortably accurate in their resemblance to events that had not yet occurred when the paint was applied. Faces and places and moments rendered in a style that was not technically accomplished in the way of a trained artist but was vivid with the particular energy of someone recording something urgent and true. He did not explain them. He did not offer them as evidence of anything. Sometimes, a wound is dressed privately. The dressing does not make it less real. Betagarman Slaughter. The campaign called the Titan Death, fought across the Betagarman system in the grinding terrible approach to the Siege of Terror, was a war of scale that resists the intimate telling. It was vast, in the way that the late stages of the heresy had become vast, each engagement consuming resources and lives and irreplaceable capability at a rate that both sides understood was unsustainable and neither side could afford to be the first to acknowledge. The Titans walked at Betagarman. The god machines of the Collegia Titanica, those immense and ancient engines of war that bestride a battlefield like moving fortifications, like armored mountains, granted the capacity for direction and intent. They walked in numbers that the records of the engagement still struggle to convey without tipping into the incredible. Leman walked among them. He did what the Wolf King did when the situation had been reduced to its most fundamental terms. He fought, close and personal and without the intermediary of distance or mechanism, against things that were not built to be fought at close quarters by a single being and that discovered, in the discovering, that their assumptions had been optimistic. Traitor forces broke around him. Titans, those mighty engines before which space marines are individually small and individually fragile, found that the calculus changed when what was approaching them was a Primarch at full expression, a being for whom the appropriate scale of comparison was not the individual Astartes but something older and less categorizable. He tore through Betagarman. There are things the heresy produced that have no comfortable name. The Wolf King at War was one of them. Russ versus Horus. Assault on the Vengeful Spirit. The Vengeful Spirit was not simply a warship. It had been Horus's flagship before the heresy, in the years when Horus was still what he had appeared to be. The War Master. The Emperor's most beloved son, the being in whom the hopes of the entire crusade had been concentrated and made personal. The ship had carried Horus across the galaxy on the business of reunification and expansion, had been present at victories that were still sung in the legions that remained loyal, had been the center from which the greatest military mind of the age had conducted the greatest military undertaking in human history. It carried a different cargo now. What Horus had become. What had been done to him, or what he had chosen to become, or some combination of the two that may never be fully separable, had marked the ship as it had marked the man. The Vengeful Spirit had been present at Istvan. It had carried the orders that had shattered the legions. It had been the point from which the heresy had been directed across the years of its terrible unfolding, and the warp had left its fingerprints on every surface. Leman boarded it at Trisolian. The decision to board, to take the fight from the void into the corridors of the enemy flagship, to go personally into the place where Horus was not made lightly or impulsively, whatever the Wolf King's reputation for impulsiveness suggested. It was made with the full understanding of what was aboard the Vengeful Spirit and what awaited anyone who went looking for it. The hunter had found his quarry's den. He went in anyway. The spear of Russ wounding Horus. He carried a spear. This is noted because it is specific, and the specificity matters. A weapon chosen for a particular purpose, brought to a particular encounter, wielded with the full intention of ending what it was brought to end. The spear of Russ was not a weapon of ceremony. It was a weapon of war, ancient and rune-marked in the Fenrisian tradition, carrying in its crafting the accumulated intention of a people who understood that some things needed to be killed with more than ordinary steel. They fought aboard the vengeful spirit, in the corrupted corridors of a ship that the warp had been remaking in its own image across the years of the heresy. A place where the architecture did not entirely behave as architecture should, where the light was wrong and the distances were unreliable and the simple physical reality of the engagement was complicated by the presence of something vast and interested watching from the other side of what should have been solid walls. Leman drove the spear into Horus, the War Master. The thing that Horus had become, armored in the corruption of the four powers, bearing in his body the full investment of chaos in its chosen instrument, was wounded. This must be stated with the weight it deserves. Wounding Horus at the height of his power, in that place, with the warp pouring through him like a current through a conductor, was not a small thing. It was not an incident. It was one of the very few moments in the heresy when the forces of chaos bled. The beloved brother. The Wolf King did not hesitate. This too must be said. The spear was lost. In the aftermath of the boarding, in the chaos of extraction from a flagship that was not going to allow the boarding party to leave without argument, in the fighting through corridors that had become less reliable as the engagement progressed and the warp presence aboard the vengeful spirit responded to the wounding of its chosen vessel. The spear was lost. How precisely, is not recorded with the clarity that would satisfy those who study such things. The accounts of the survivors of the boarding action have the quality that accounts of extreme experiences often have. Vivid in their particulars but inconsistent in their sequencing, complete in their emotional truth and fragmentary in their logistical detail. The spear was there, and then it was not, and the circumstances of its disappearance are somewhere in the gap between those two states. The loss mattered. Not merely as a matter of sentiment, though the Fenrisian tradition invested weapons of significance with a personal weight that made their loss genuinely grievable. The spear had wounded Horus. It had, in that wounding, demonstrated a capacity that made it something more than a relic of historical interest. It had proven, in the most direct and empirical way available, that Horus could be reached. That the armor of his corruption was not absolute. That the investment of chaos in its instrument had limits. A weapon with that proof embedded in it, lost in the aftermath of the moment it had made, becoming thereafter an absence that the Legion's law marked and mourned. Some things are lost at the moment of their greatest significance. The galaxy keeps no accounting of what it takes. Loyal to the end. It is worth pausing, at the close of the chapter that takes Leman Russ through the worst years the Imperium has ever known, to say the simple thing plainly. He did not turn. This is not nothing. In a heresy that turned brother against brother, that found the weaknesses in beings who had seemed without weakness, that offered each of the Primarchs something. Pride, power, grief, the grievance of the long-nursed wound finally given permission to express itself. Leman was offered his share of temptations and walked past them. He had loved Horus, and Horus had become the instrument of the greatest catastrophe in human history. He had burned Prospero on an order that may have been manipulated by the very forces he was fighting against, had been, in the most painful possible way, used. He had been ambushed, and diminished, and forced to watch the galaxy he had helped to build come apart. He had carried visions that nobody had asked him to carry, painted them in secret on the walls of his flagship, and said nothing about what he saw. And he had remained. Not because loyalty was easy. The accounts do not suggest that it was easy, for him or for anyone who kept faith through the heresy. Not because he did not feel the weight of what had been done and what had been lost. But because at the bottom of everything, beneath the pride and the fury and the capacity for violence that Fenris had built into him, there was something that the wolves had taught him long before the Emperor's ship had ever descended through Fenris's clouds. The pack holds. Whatever comes, the pack holds. He was the Wolf King. He held. After the heresy. Reluctance on the Codex. The wars were over. This is the thing that takes a long time to become real, after a conflict of sufficient duration and sufficient cost. The simple fact of the ending, which the mind has spent so long refusing to anticipate, that it arrives without the relief that might have been expected and with a weight of its own that is different from the weight of the fighting but not necessarily lighter. Robute Guilliman had survived. He had returned to a galaxy that had been broken and had done what Guilliman did when presented with a broken thing. He had begun, methodically and with the exhaustive attention to structural detail that was the signature of everything he built, to design a replacement. The Codex Astartes was the result. A document of extraordinary thoroughness, a complete reimagining of how the legions should be organized, how they should operate, how their strength should be distributed across the Imperium so that what had happened, the heresy, the turning of legions, the catastrophic consequence of too much power concentrated in too few hands, could not happen again. Leman read it, or was presented with its conclusions, and rejected it. Not entirely. He was not, and had never been, incapable of recognizing the merit in positions he disagreed with. But the core of it, the breaking of the legions into smaller chapters, the imposition of uniformity onto institutions that had been built from the specific character of their primarchs. This he would not accept. The space wolves were the Vulca Fenrica. They were not a template to be divided and distributed. A wolf cannot be made into a kennel of dogs by redrawing the paperwork. One-eyed warriors. The body carries history. This is something the Fenrisians have always understood. That the scars a warrior bears are a text, readable by those who know the language, recording in the permanent medium of flesh the encounters that have shaped the person within it. You can learn a great deal about a man from his scars. Sometimes you can learn more from the scars than from anything he would willingly tell you. Leman bore scars. This is not remarkable in itself. He had been fighting since before the Emperor found him, on a world that produced casualties the way other worlds produced weather, and the years of the heresy had added to the collection. But there was one scar in particular, across the eye, that had become something more than a record of a specific injury. It had become a symbol. The Einherjar, the elite warriors of the space wolves who distinguished themselves within an institution not known for low standards, began, in the years after the heresy, to bear similar markings. Not as affectation, not as the empty mimicry of a status symbol adopted without understanding, but as a genuine act of identification. A statement, made in the register that their Primarch had taught them to take seriously, of shared experience and shared commitment. To bear the scar was to say, I have been where the cost is highest. I have paid something real. I am of the pack that does not stop. Whether Leman himself sanctioned this practice or simply observed it with the particular expression of a man who finds himself moved by something he had not expected, the accounts do not agree. The greatest leaders do not always know what they have taught until they see it reflected in those who learned it. Varaja Wolf Guard. A pack leader does not move alone. This is not weakness. It is the correct expression of what a pack leader is, which is the center of something rather than a solitary point. The pack leader without a pack is simply a wolf, and a wolf alone, however formidable, is a diminished thing relative to what it could be at the center of its proper context. The Varaja were Leman's proper context. His wolf guard. The warriors who accompanied him not as a ceremonial escort, not as a diplomatic gesture toward the expected conventions of a Primarch's household, but as actual fighting companions in the fullest sense of the term, were drawn from the best the space wolves produced, which meant they were drawn from a pool that would have been exceptional in any other legion, and that was, in the Vulca Fenrica, simply the standard for those who wanted to be considered for the position. They had run with him. Through the crusade, through the burning of Prospero, through the Alaxis Nebula and the ambush that had cost the fleet so dearly, through Beta Garman and the boarding of the Vengeful Spirit. They had been present for the events that the sagas would spend the next 10,000 years attempting to do justice to, and they had been present not as observers but as participants. Bleeding and fighting and, some of them, dying in the business of keeping the Wolf King alive and effective. They went where he went. Always. Without exception. The pack does not ask whether the path is safe. It asks whether the pack leader is going. Bond with Malcador. Not all of the connections that Leman formed in the long years of the Crusade and the Heresy were forged in the familiar currencies of combat and shared campaign and the particular intimacy of warriors who have bled alongside one another. Some were quieter than that, made in the spaces between the larger events, in conversations rather than battles. Malcador the Sigillite occupies a singular position in the history of the Imperium. The Emperor's Regent, the First Lord of Terror, a man of such extraordinary age and accumulated capability that even the Primarchs, beings who were not easily impressed by human achievement, tended to regard him with a specific and careful attention. He was old in a way that went beyond the merely biological. He had been present at the foundations of things. He had helped to build what was being fought over. The friendship between Leman and Malcador was unlikely, on the face of it. The Wolf King and the ancient administrator. The feral Primarch and the subtle political mind that had helped to shape the Imperium's institutional architecture. They did not appear, by any obvious calculus, to be natural companions. And yet, perhaps it was precisely the distance between them that made the connection possible. The way that two people who share no assumptions can sometimes speak to one another with a directness that is not available between those whose similarities create the expectation of agreement. Malcador was honest with Leman in ways that required courage, and Leman listened to Malcador in ways that required humility. The rarest friendships are those between people who have no reason to flatter one another. The disappearance of the Wolf King. Warp vision of Wolf time. The visions had been with him since Prospero. He had carried them across the years of the heresy and into the broken peace that followed, painting them in secret on the walls of his flagship, keeping them in the interior place where he kept everything that he had not yet found the right words for. In the years after the heresy, the visions changed. Not in their frequency, not in the quality of their arrival. Still the thin hours, still the space between sleeping and waking, still the fragmentary and non-linear impressions that resisted the clean narrative structure of the saga form and arrived instead as feeling shapes, as the emotional truth of events before the events themselves had found their final form. But in their content, he had seen betrayals. He had seen faces turning. He had seen the specific and personal texture of what the heresy was going to cost before the heresy had fully revealed itself. These visions had been terrible, but they had been, in a way that only becomes visible in retrospect, contained. They had been about what was happening. The new visions were about what was coming. The Fenrisians had a word for it. The wolf time. The ending of endings, the final winter that does not break into spring. Every culture that has looked honestly at the nature of things has arrived, by one path or another, at the same conclusion. That what has a beginning has an ending, and that the ending, when it comes, will be commensurate with the scale of what is ending. What Leman saw, in those hours, was commensurate. He did not share the details. Some knowledge is too heavy to distribute. Prophecy of return. A leader who simply disappears leaves a scar. This is the difference between an ending and a departure. That a departure carries within it the possibility of return, and the possibility of return changes the nature of the waiting, transforms it from grief into something that can be lived with, carried forward, built around without being built over. Leman understood this. He had spent his life understanding the pack, and the pack's needs, and the specific damage that is done to a pack when its center is removed without explanation. He made the promise. It was not made in the formal register of the oath-swearing that the Fenrisian tradition had elaborate protocols for. This was not a sword laid on an altar, not a blood binding, not a witness declaration before the assembled legion. It was smaller than that, and more personal, and in its smallness more durable than many larger things. He said, in the way that he said things when he meant them completely, that he would return. The condition he named was the wolf time. When the great darkness came, when the ending he had seen in the visions was no longer vision but present reality, when the Imperium faced the final reckoning that he had watched approaching in the secret hours of his painted murals. In that moment, he said, he would come back. The Space Wolves have carried this promise for 10,000 years. They have carried it not as a comfort exactly. It contains too much acknowledgement of what it would take to redeem it for simple comfort, but as an orientation, a direction to face. A pack that knows its leader will return does not scatter. It holds the ground and waits. Prophecy to Bjorn. Bjorn had been with him long enough to have earned the particular trust that only time and demonstrated loyalty can build. Not the trust extended to capability, which can be assessed relatively quickly, but the deeper trust extended to character, which requires years of observation across the full range of circumstances that a life in the Vulca Fenrica provides. He was called Bjorn the Fell-Handed, and he was among the greatest of the Wolf Guard, and when Leman looked at the legion he had built and asked himself who among them could hold what he had made in the shape he had made it, Bjorn was the answer. The conversation between them, the one in which Leman entrusted the leadership of the Space Wolves to Bjorn's keeping, is preserved in the Legion's oral tradition with the care that the most important things are preserved. Not verbatim, not with the false precision of a transcript, but in its essential truth, the emotional core of it kept intact through the generations of telling. What Leman gave Bjorn was not merely authority. Authority can be granted by anyone with sufficient rank. What he gave was understanding. The particular and hard-won knowledge of what the Space Wolves were, what they required, what they could endure and what would break them, how to hold the balance between the wolf and the man that he had spent his entire Primarch's life demonstrating was possible. He gave Bjorn everything he knew about keeping the pack whole. The greatest gift a leader can give is the knowledge of how to lead without them. Last Toast Prophecy. The feast was loud, as Space Wolf feasts tend to be. Not performatively loud, not the orchestrated celebration of an institution demonstrating its own vitality, but organically, genuinely loud, in the way of a culture that has always understood that the sharing of food and drink around a fire is one of the things that separates a pack from a collection of individuals. Leman was present. He ate and drank with his warriors in the manner of a man who is entirely where he is, not pulled toward the next thing, not managing the present moment from a slight distance. Fully there, in the hall, with his brothers and his sons and the noise and the warmth and the smell of the fire. At some point in the evening he rose, and the hall quieted in the way that halls quiet when something is about to be said that is worth hearing. He raised his cup. What he said has been turned over and examined from every available angle by every scald and rune priest and historian the Space Wolves have produced in the 10,000 years since the evening. The words themselves are agreed upon, more or less. It is the meaning that has generated the debate, because what he said was not a toast to the Legion, not a declaration of loyalty or pride or the ringing affirmation of shared purpose that such moments traditionally produce. It was something quieter, something that sounded, to those who heard it with the context of what happened next, like a man saying farewell in the language of a person who had decided not to use the word. The best hunters go alone into the dark. They do not ask the pack to follow. Mysterious fate. He was there, and then he was not. The Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, that annual observance of the moment that the Imperium marks as the beginning of the Emperor's eternal vigil upon the Golden Throne, the hinge point around which the imperial calendar turns, was not an unusual occasion for the space wolves to observe. They observed it as they observed most things. With sincerity rather than ceremony, with mead rather than solemnity, with the noise and warmth that their culture had always preferred to the quieter expressions of devotion that other institutions favored. Leman was at the feast. Multiple accounts confirm this. He was seen, he spoke, he raised the toast that those present would spend the rest of their lives interpreting. He was present in the full and physical sense of the word, large and warm and alive in the firelight of the hall. And then the feast continued, and at some point, the accounts are frustratingly imprecise about the exact moment, as accounts of absences tend to be, because the absence is only registered after the fact, and by then the precise sequence of events has been displaced by the shock of realizing what has occurred. He was not there. No ship had departed. No gate had opened. No rune priest had sensed the particular quality of warp transition that the departure of a Primarch would, presumably, have produced in the Empyrean. No body had been found, which was itself significant. In the Legion's tradition, the absence of a body is not the same as the presence of death. The Wolf King had gone hunting. Where, and for what, he had not said. He left as the wolves leave. Without announcement, without farewell, into the dark between one moment and the next. The pack waited. The pack is waiting still. Legacy of the Wolf King. 13th Company Rumors. The Warp does not keep reliable records. This is one of its defining characteristics. That the ordinary instruments of verification, the cross-referenced accounts and the physical evidence and the corroborating testimony that history requires before it will commit to a claim, do not function there in the ways that would make certainty possible. The warp is a place where certainty goes to become something more complicated. And so the rumors about the 13th Company exist in the space that certainty has vacated, and they have existed there for 10,000 years, and they have not diminished. The 13th Company of the Space Wolves went into the warp during the heresy. Pursuing the Thousand Suns by some accounts, or pursuing something else, or simply being taken by the circumstance of an engagement that left them on the wrong side of a closing rift with no immediately available route back to the material world. They did not return. This is the agreed fact. Everything beyond it is the territory of the rumor. What the rumor says is this: that they are still there. Still fighting, in whatever the warp offers as a battlefield, against whatever the warp produces as an enemy. That they have endured in that place where time does not run in the direction it is supposed to run, aged and changed in ways that 10,000 years in the warp would produce. But present, active, pursuing. And at their head, the rumor says, always at their head, because this is where he always was, the Wolf King himself. Still hunting. Still running. The solitary hunt that the last toast hinted at, conducted in the strangest and most hostile territory the galaxy contains. The 13th Company does not answer. The silence is not the same as an answer of no. The Rudra armor. A Primarch leaves traces. This is not merely the metaphorical truth of legacy and influence, though it is that too. The ways in which a life of sufficient force and character continues to shape events long after the person has ceased to be directly present in them. It is also the literal truth of objects. Of things made and used and set down, or lost, or taken, or hidden against the need of a future that the person hiding them may or may not have been able to fully see. Leman left things behind. In the ordinary course of 10,000 years of campaigning conducted in his name and his memory, the Space Wolves have encountered them. In places that required some explanation of how they came to be there, recovered under circumstances that the rune priests tend to regard with the specific attention they reserve for things that do not feel entirely accidental. The Rudra armor is among the most significant of these recoveries. A relic of the Wolf King himself, bearing in its construction and its markings the unmistakable character of Fenrisian craft at its highest expression, found in circumstances that the formal records describe with a careful neutrality that does not fully contain the significance the Legion attaches to the finding. Relics of this kind are not merely historical objects to the Space Wolves. They are not museum pieces, not items of sentimental value to be displayed and protected from the wear of further use. They are proof, renewed and physical, that the Wolf King existed, that what he was is recoverable, that the trace he left on the material world has not yet fully faded. What a man touches, he marks. The marks outlast the man. Sometimes they outlast almost everything else. The Great Hunts. The Space Wolves have never stopped looking. This should be understood not as a failure to accept the reality of an absence. The Volca Fenrica are not a legion given to self-deception about hard truths, having been shaped by a world and a Primarch that considered clarity about difficult realities a survival skill rather than a luxury. They understand that he is gone in the sense that he is not here. They understand that 10,000 years is a long time, and that the galaxy has changed in ways he did not see, and that the search has not yet produced the thing it is searching for. They search anyway. This is the distinction that matters. The Great Hunts are not exercises in wishful thinking. They are operations. Real, dangerous, conducted in the genuine spirit of the Volca Fenrica's oldest traditions, ranging across the most hostile territories that the galaxy provides in pursuit of signs that are sometimes clear and sometimes ambiguous and sometimes visible only to the rune priests whose training equips them to read things that ordinary perception cannot reach. What they find, occasionally, is something. A trace. A suggestion. An encounter that the participants file in the category of things that do not have a fully satisfying mundane explanation and that the Legion's lore reaches for with a carefully maintained hope that has not, across 10,000 years, collapsed into certainty in either direction. The hunt continues because the pack that stops hunting has already, in some essential way, stopped being a pack. They search for the Wolf King as he taught them to search for anything. Without ceasing, without complaint, and without deciding in advance what they will or will not find. Corellian conspiracy foiled. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is not the galaxy that Leman Russ left behind. It has been reshaped by 10,000 years of war and decay and the slow grinding attrition of an Imperium fighting on every front simultaneously against enemies that do not tire and do not negotiate and do not accept the argument that humanity deserves to survive simply because it would prefer to. The Space Wolves have fought in all of it. They have fought as their Primarch taught them to fight. At the front, in the thick of it, with instinct and loyalty and the ferocity of a pack that has never forgotten what it is protecting or why the protection matters. The Corellian conspiracy is one campaign among many. One of the countless engagements that do not make the great sagas but that constitute the actual substance of what the Volca Fenrica do in the long years of the Wolf King's absence. A threat identified, assessed, and dismantled. An enemy that had believed itself hidden, discovering that the Space Wolves' capacity for finding things that do not want to be found extends well beyond the search for their Primarch. What matters in the telling of it is not the specific tactical detail, the movements of forces and the sequence of engagements and the final resolution, but the quality of the thing. The way it was handled. The instinct and the loyalty and the particular combination of ferocity and intelligence that Leman had spent his life demonstrating was possible and that his legion has spent 10,000 years proving was not merely his personal achievement but a transmissible inheritance. The Wolf King is absent. His teachings are not absent. The difference is everything. Gehenna System Purge. And so we come, at last, to the present. Or what passes for the present in a galaxy where the past is never fully past and the future is visible, to those with the eyes for it, in the patterns that the past has established. The Gehenna System Purge is recent history, by the reckoning of an Imperium that measures its history in millennia. The Space Wolves went to Gehenna because something there required what the Space Wolves provide. The specific and irreplaceable capability of a legion that was built for exactly this, for the moment when the thing that needs to be hunted has gone to ground in a place that other instruments cannot reach or will not go. They purged it. This is the simple account. The longer account lives in the saga that is being composed about it now, in the tradition that Leman established when he composed his own sagas about the monster hunts of his youth. The careful attention to detail, the recording of what worked and what did not, the transmission of hard-won knowledge in a form that will survive the individuals who earned it. The space wolves who fought at Gehenna did not fight in Leman's name in the way that a memorial is conducted in someone's name, as an act of retrospective honor, looking backward. They fought in his spirit, which is a different thing entirely. Looking forward. Carrying what he gave them into ground he never saw, against enemies he never faced, in service of a humanity that has changed enormously since he last walked among it. He gave them what Fenris gave him. The knowledge that the cold does not last forever, that the dark always ends, that the pack, if it holds, will see the morning. The Wolf King has not returned. The wolves run on. They are running still. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, or in the stranger dark beyond them, something ancient and enormous and patient is still hunting. It will come back when it is needed. It always does.